Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session. That's the social policies addressing issues related to the low fertility in the context of low middle income countries, and particularly focus on the issues like rights and the choices and also effective. So the next, what we're going to have is a kind of the academic or intellectual conversations on the social policies related to the low fertility. And I think what we want to focus is, since this is actually sort of the Campbell community, there are lots of kind of challenging questions related to the low fertility and how we can actually sort of such a challenging questions into the Campbell, how we can tackle them, and that's actually something that we'll discuss in the next hour or so. Let me introduce myself. My name is Rintaro Mori, the regional advisor of the low fertility at the Asia Pacific Regional Office of the UNFPA. We are moderator today, so let's see. And for those of you who actually are sort of tuning into this actual session, later on, we might have actual sessions on the questions and answers. So please be encouraged to put your questions in the Q&A. And also to bear with us, the platform is a bit of a new. We might actually have a sort of hiccups to actually sort of on the anyway. So this 1 hour we have found what we're going to do from each of the panelists to talk about sort of the brief introductions of yourself, as well as what would be sort of the kind of the key issues, and that's sort of the interesting research questions on how we can actually make that questions on the low fertility policies in low-income countries context into that sort of the kind of review context of research methodology. Now, we haven't got sort of the fully on board, but I think that we pretty need to start anyway. So shall we start from Howard? The kind of in the Campbell collaborations, and I think if you could actually sort of talk about, of course, if you could actually briefly introduce yourself, as well as maybe actually sort of talk us through the recent Campbell work and particular methodology and your proposal maybe, and I think then we can probably go into the round the table. Is that okay?
Yeah, okay. I've shared my screen. Can you see it?
Let me just do it, I think.
It says I'm sharing.
Okay.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can see it, but it's small, but I think.
Okay, yeah, I can fix that. I just, because now I can't see you. I can only see my screen. Yes, it's good? Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, thanks. Yes, I'm also struggling with the platform. So I'm Howard White. I work at the Campbell Research Programme and various other positions. And what I do is work with people on helping build the evidence architecture to develop what I call evidence-based decision-making products, EPDMs. It doesn't catch on. I understand why, in order to get evidence-based decision-making made across a range of sectors. So we're just starting the work down there of low fertility. So the main takeaway from my message is come back in a year's time. Because then I'll have some stuff to show you that's actually of interest. So I'm going to be talking very conceptually, briefly now about what we're planning to do. And it won't be in the area of low fertility because we've not yet started the work in low fertility. Actually, we've done some scoping, but I'm not presenting that. So the basic logic of what I do is built around this diagram, which I call the evidence architecture. Now, this is not like the evidence pyramid you might be used to, in which RCTs or reviews are at the top and they're the bestest thing. This is not a hierarchy of what's best. It's a hierarchy of how curated or brokered the evidence is. So I won't go through all the levels, but near the bottom we have primary studies, and they get summarized in reviews, and then primary studies and reviews can go into databases and maps and so on. We'll talk a bit about maps, but the key thing are the top 3 levels of the pyramids, which are evidence portals, guidelines, and checklists. And these evidence-based decision-making products for EPDMPs. And the key thing about them is that they allow decision makers to make evidence-informed decisions without having to go back and read the research reports. And they really are wonderful at doing that job. And so the whole world should be making them. And that's sort of my mission in life, and partly Campbell's mission in life, is to promote the use of these EPDMPs based on systematic reviews. So the best known type of um, evidence product like this is the WHO guidelines. So we all know WHO guidelines, and they are based on systematic reviews. WHO has guidelines and producing guidelines that say our guidelines must be based on systematic reviews, which is relatively, newish, 15 years now thing. And other UN agencies don't have that in general. Other UN agencies base their guidelines, if they have them, on the old model of expert opinion, and we're trying to change that. So what we do is we say we use evidence and gap maps, EGMs is evidence and gap maps, and I'm going to be showing you some, in a strategic way to say we want to build these evidence products at the top of the pyramid, but the top of the pyramid won't stay there without having a solid base. So you need the bottom of the pyramid for the top to stand up. And so what we do is use evidence maps to survey the base of the pyramid and say, what's down there? Are there lots of reviews? Are there lots of reviews already? We can go ahead and build the top. There are lots of primary studies, but no reviews. Then we need to start commissioning reviews. And if there's zilch, virtually nothing there, then we just need to be commissioning more primary studies. So doing ends and gap maps, what we're starting with doing with UNFPA is not a means to an end, but it's an end in it's not an end in itself, it's a means to an end. Having said that, they are a valuable resource, and we'll see an example in a minute. So here's an example of another evidence product, with what we call evidence toolkit. These are produced by What Work centres, particularly in the UK and the US, and they've proved very successful, particularly in the UK, getting decision makers make evidence-based decisions. So 3/4 of schools, a large number of youth offending teams across England and Wales use these things in areas of education, youth offending, homelessness, youth employment, and local economic development, and so on. And we, Campbell teams, have worked for a number of the What Work centres in developing these products. And I'm just showing one example here. So this is an example of the Youth Endowment Foundation, whose job is to tackle serious violence amongst youth, and we interpret that as being offending more generally. And these toolkits lay out a range of approaches to tackle youth offending. So what we want to do is something like this, with a range of policies that might be appropriate for tackling low fertility. And it names the approaches, and then it gives 3 key metrics. They are the cost on a scale of 1 to 3 or 1 to 5, the evidence strength, which is both the quality of the review on which this toolkit strand is based, but also on the quality and the breadth and depth, basically, of the underlying research going into that systematic review or systematic reviews, and then the impact. And there are various ways of presenting that, but here we do it low, moderate, high, and indeed harmful. You see one here is harmful. So we would have a toolkit saying, does this policy actually have an effect on fertility? What does it cost? And so on. And that's the top level. You can click on any one of these levels in the toolkit, and you can read more about the approach. So what it is, anything around implementation, anything around contextual factors. And clearly, as we'll see, I think, with discussion, this is a very value-laden area. Lots of things that we know are drivers of low fertility are things that we might not want to say, okay, well, we're going to stop women going to school, we're going to stop having jobs for women, we're going to have mass immigration, things that we might do to tackle the consequences or to interrupt the drivers. They're value issues. So those discussions need to come in here. And this second level of the toolkit is based on a technical report, which is a summary of a systematic review. So the whole toolkit rests on systematic reviews. And we've done it now. I've got 20 odd strands in the toolkit, and now we're commissioning new reviews to add additional strands to that toolkit. And the reviews we've got in it were identified through evidence mapping. So this Youth Endowment Fund evidence and gap map. It's got over 2,000 studies of different approaches, including mainly preventive approaches to reducing youth offending. So we've done lots of these maps in lots of sectors over the last 10 years or so now. So the evidence gap map is a systematic presentation. So they're a rigorous evidence synthesis project like a systematic review, but they show you what evidence is available across quite a broad sector rather than saying what the evidence says. So they don't say what the evidence says, they just say here's the available evidence. And most maps are intervention maps showing here are the interventions and here are the outcomes. And we'll see an example in a moment for, here's one for road safety. We have, say, lots on different topics. And so you'd have different interventions, typically 15, 20 rows of different intervention categories and different outcome categories. For road safety, they're fatal and non-fatal crashes and injuries, and then intermediate outcomes like speeding, drinking, substance abuse, wearing seat belts, and so on. And so we have each cell in this matrix shows you how many studies there are that look at the impact of enforcement on speeding. And the bigger the bubble, the more studies there are. And these maps are interactive, so you can, sorry, let's show you what's there. So I'll come back to that in a second. Anything you code, you can actually make your own column heading. So on the road safety map, we've done that making regions the column headings, because that's particularly important here. WHO data show that 91% of road traffic fatalities and injuries are in low middle income countries, whereas over 80% of the studies come from North America. And the evidence is not readily transferable for a number of reasons I won't go into here. And so that points to a common finding in health of 80% of the burden of disease being developing countries, but 80% of the research being on developed country diseases. And so it's the same in road safety, and this version of the map brings it out quite clearly. The maps are interactive, so you can hover over a particular bubble, you can see how many studies there are in that cell, so 100 primary studies, 19 systematic reviews. You can click on the cell and you get a list of those studies, and on the right hand side you see the URL, so you can click on the URL of any study there and you get to the study itself or the abstract. The study might be behind a paywall. We try to find a non-paywall version put into the map, but we can't. Then you get to the paywall unless your institution has a subscription to get you past the paywall. So the maps don't just lay out what evidence is there and they're repositories of all available evidence in this space. They actually show you how they actually allow you to access the evidence as well. So we've curated the evidence by organizing it in a framework, which the map framework, the intervention outcome categories, but we also actually find the studies, upload them, summarize them briefly, and put them there in the map. So the URLs there in the map so you can access them. What we're doing for low fertility is basically 4 stages. We're working now, when we get a contract, we're working now on conceptual development of map frameworks. Then we're going to be doing the evidence mapping in the first part of next year, and that will identify some systematic reviews that UNFPA think will be useful to commission in order to build these evidence-based decision-making products, the top level of the pyramid, where we want to get to. So evidence mapping, look at the bottom of the pyramid, then see what can we do? Are the reviews already? Okay, let's build the top. Up, there are no reviews already. We need to commission those reviews. We'll do those reviews. So we're actually doing 4 maps. This is an approach we're using with WHO already in the area of elder abuse, where we're not just doing an intervention map. So we're doing a map of prevalence. What's the prevalence of, what risk factors are a bit tricky for me here. So in the end, you'll see I've split risk factors across individual and societal, because what I had in mind was prevalence, drivers, interventions and consequences of low fertility. That all makes sense, but I always wondered, well, risk factors clearly sort of ought to fit there in somewhere. It's a terminology we're familiar with. And so what are the risk factors for being at risk of low fertility? And currently I've split those across the prevalence and drivers maps. As we work out the frameworks for these maps, we'll try and figure that out a bit more. So we're going to be doing some scoping. We actually already started that, though we haven't got the contract. So we've been collecting a couple hundred studies on low fertility. We've got them all, and we've been looking at what they contain. And once we get the contract, we'll start doing the work, developing a framework based on that scoping. So thank you. That's it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Howard. That's a very good, actually, sort of the proposal and also the excellent, actually, sort of overview of the different outputs. So Campbell can produce not only just Campbell reviews, but a different kind of set of the outputs, including the work, the evidence gap map, the considering actually the context of the regions that actually you actually mentioned about the road accident, which is actually excellent. So now I think what we're going to how we can actually sort of the conceptualize each element of the low fertility policies. Can I call upon Thomas, actually? Thomas has done a very good review with us on the low fertility policy. So he has a good, thorough knowledge on the sort of what is there, and maybe actually sort of you're talking about this, our review. I think if you could actually briefly introduce yourself, and I think then
opinions of
the comments on the work. So over to you, Thomas.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me and follow me because I am struggling with technology since since the start of the session. So I'm not even attempting to join to share screen and show you the presentation because I think I would end up struggling 5 minutes with trying to share the screen with you. So let me just talk through some of my points. Maybe this what I will try to do in the next 5 minutes would be a very summary of some of the work I did for UNFPA with my colleagues Anna Matysiak and Zuzana Brzezowska, where we reviewed the impact of family policies on fertility in low fertility countries, mostly based on the existing literature, but also providing a lot of illustrations based on data for selected low fertility, high income countries. And my main points are about the difficulties of studying the policy fertility nexus and all the considerations that need to be taken into account when studying this relationship, which is a kind of starting point for the discussion. How can we do better? How can we be sure that we are analyzing in a right way? Now, to start with, maybe my very starting point is that there are so many different policies which may be or are actually influencing fertility rates. And so the issue is that we are dealing with the whole package of many different things which potentially affect fertility rates. And these policies are often changing not in a big bang fashion, but gradually. Governments are gradually increasing the financial support for families. Some governments are announcing several new policies every year or two. I have an example, for instance, in the publication of a timeline of development of pronatalist family policies in Japan, where the government has been announcing dozens of new policies since the early 1990s. And obviously, each of these policies is somehow alone and in combination with all other policies affecting fertility rates, but it's almost impossible. I think it's impossible to look at them in isolation and study their individual contribution to fertility. The next point, which is also related to this, is that many governments have many policies affecting fertility in place without necessarily having the impact on fertility in mind as the main motivation for having these policies. These policies are there for many different reasons, and the pronatalist impact is often just one out of many, or the very last consideration why these policies are in place. So I mentioned the complexity. The next point I want to mention is that many policies are actually incoherent and inconsistent. So we like to think about the policy package, about, let's say, for instance, financial monetary policy supporting parents being aligned with policies related to parental leave, which may be well aligned with policies about childcare provision, public childcare provision. But in fact, many of these policies are not well aligned, and this can also be a drag when thinking of their potential impact on fertility rates. Some policies may have very quick influence. If you offer next year that you double the amount parents receive as cash benefits when on parental leave, or that you double the amount of child allowances, monthly child allowances for all parents, some parents may be happy to have a child, thinking that they should act quickly before the government changes its mind, or before the next government comes in place, or before the next financial crisis forces the government to cut the subsidies. Some other policies may show very slow, gradual influence. If you are improving the childcare availability, this cannot be done from one day to the next. This is usually a work lasting years and years and years, and one cannot expect that many couples will suddenly start having kids when, for instance, the childcare availability improves a little bit next year and then again next year. This is really a long-term perspective which we need to look at. Some policies are unstable, I mentioned that. Some are unpredictable. There is an issue of discontinuity. But moreover, another difficulty is that policies often make people not necessarily changing their number of kids, but rather having the kids they want to have anyway a little bit earlier in life, or having the second or the third kid a little bit sooner after the previous one. So policies are often changing the timing of birth. They have an impact on birth intervals. But if we look at the number of kids women or couples have at the end of their reproductive life, question is often, or the findings are often much more questionable, whether policies 10, 20 years ago have really affected the number of kids people have at the end of their reproductive lives. And maybe the final point, so that I'm not taking too much time, when looking, even in the ideal case, when we have like a policy experiment, the government starts a big new policy, which really changes the game for the families, or there is a new policy which clearly affects one population group and not the other group. So we can really take it as a kind of experimental environment. We can study what is the impact on the behavior of the group who is targeted by the policy compared to the group who is not targeted by the policy. The trouble is often that there is some trend in fertility or in birth rates among these groups before the policy came into the existence, and this trend needs to be taken into account. Simply stated, we often don't know the counterfactuals. What would happen in the absence of a given policy? Would fertility rates continue in the pre-policy trend? Would they change their trend? We often don't know, and that increases also the methodological requirements and the methodological difficulty of studying these policies. So with that, I can only conclude that when we look at the past research on policy impact on fertility, we often have examples of researchers studying the same policy trend, such as the maternity capital in Russia, which was introduced, clearly pronatalist policy introduced around 2007, working with the same data and arriving at entirely different contrasting conclusions about the impact of these policies and whether these policies actually had any tangible impact on fertility rates. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Thomas. And I think particularly I think you highlighted, I thought very relevant to the conversation today is that one is an inconsistency among these policies. And I think some of the inconsistency could be because it's coming from the scientific factors that which we might not know. Then how we can make it as a sort of the systematic reviews, that would be the big questions. But I think it's more the bigger question might be the pronatalistic approach, how we can actually accommodate that into the sort of the kind of the reviews, which is leading to the next intervention from Vicky that I really want to sort of highlight you on the rights and choices issues. Particularly, I think Vicky, we worked together on the sort of the fertility regulating policies in Asia Pacific region. So from your experiences, also I think if you could briefly introduce yourself, then I think probably our work and okay, your comments on the issues. Thank you.
Super. Thank you so much, Rintaro. Hello, everyone. I'm Vicky Boydell, and I'm a lecturer at the University of Essex, and I had the pleasure of working with Rintaro on doing a scoping review. If we're looking at all the different structures out there of different ways of synthesizing evidence that built on, so many of the existing reviews that have been conducted in this area, some up to that kind of Campbell Cochrane standard, but of, varying ilks as well. But we also integrated into that practice-related evidence, speaking to our colleagues working in the country offices to kind of do a critical review of kind of emerging fertility regulation policies in 4 countries. And kind of central to our appraisal process was understanding the implications for individuals and couples, human rights, and the fertility politics around so many of these policies that are coming into place. And thinking through what would a rights-based approach to fertility regulating policies look like. And just, I think, when we're thinking about looking at the evidence, it's really important to recognize we have a clear normative standard we're working towards, and that was outlined in 1994 in the International Conference of Population and Development Program of Action, which 179 countries signed up to, and they all clearly endorsed, couples and individual right to decide freely and responsibly the number and spacing of one's children. So that self-determination element of it that's so critical, and is, the mandate of UNFPA itself. And this, we have to keep in mind that this is very much in response to, a history of aggressive fertility politics, particularly limitations driven by numeric targets dating back to the 60s and 70s. So, I think we have to keep in mind that self-determination to decide the number and spacing of your children when we're having these conversations, when we're looking at the evidence out there. And this is what we started to do when we undertook this scoping review, looking at these different policies and how they interact with one another to kind of lead to, a complex kind of system people are engaging when they're making fertility decisions. And I think many, several of the panelists today, have beautifully laid out some of the drivers, behind that, the nativist politics, the ethno-nationalistic, issues that drive some of these decisions about what policies are put into place. And also, how these policies work out for different populations by omission or by commission of different state actors involved. So we looked at 4 particular countries that have moved in, let's say, the last 15 years from having very aggressive fertility limitation policies in place in the Asia-Pacific region. And in some cases, with some coercive dimensions to that, who are now moving into a context of low fertility and kind of the policy responses to that, and the different policy levers that are being used, and what are kind of the rights dimension of those policies, which I think is so critical and key. And also, recognizing, the gender dimensions as well, because I think, a lot of the existing reviews that have taken place, speak to, that incomplete gender evolution that's, not happened, that lag between, the ideals of how we're going to attain, gender equality, yet not having the working conditions, not having the childcare policies in place, and then how different responses are taking place. So we've conducted this piece of research, we're in the final stages of getting it approved, and, very excited to circulate some of the findings from that. But I think it very much speaks to what Tomas was referring to, that these policies don't happen in a vacuum. There's a whole range of different policies that exist, and there's a whole political context within which they're taking place. And we have to understand how they're kind of interlocking to shape what decisions are possible for what populations as such. And I think that's a key dimension when we're thinking about the conversation and this session today, is recognizing there are so many policies. They're incoherent, how they interact with each other is rather complicated. But I think also what's key, and what we saw looking at these 4 different country contexts, is that how they play out is different and uneven. The implications play out differently for different groups, for high and low income groups, and really speaks to a kind of the stratified effects of these policies. Not only are they coherent, but how they spin out and affect, certain groups varies a lot. And then I think, those are politically charged conversations in a lot of contexts. Which groups are you supported to have children, and which groups, which populations and subpopulations are, dissuaded. So I think recognizing that diversity and recognizing kind of demographic diversity in a context, then recognizing how these policies then kind of snap into place for these wider demographic politics that are taking place is a really important consideration. And then I think another kind of consideration, having done this review and looked at, how these, complex, constellation of different policies are working, is that we have to be, when we're looking at gathering the evidence, we have to be crystal clear about what is the outcome metric that we want to capture. How are we assessing the effectiveness of these policies? Are we talking about, some kind of numeric target? Are we looking at increasing fertility rates? Are we thinking about, attaining, the great myth of the replacement rate? And we know historically that the use of numeric targets in relation to fertility can have perverse, distorting effects on how they're actually implemented. And so, I challenge us to come up with a different set of metrics by which we assess, how these complex constellations of policies are working. And, having a focus on, couples and individuals' abilities to exercise self-determination and desired family size. So I think those were kind of the key takeaways that I would encourage us to consider when we're looking at how we're going to synthesize the evidence into something that can be informative for policies going forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, I think sort of the lesson to learn from the discussion papers and fertility regulating policies, and particularly I think what we put it based on your actual interventions. Yeah, certainly I think what will be the outcomes that what we are looking at, but also what I thought about is the policies, policy target populations, whether we actually targeting individuals or if we are looking at small supranational level populations, or you mentioned about a diverse different type of the populations within the country, whether we actually going to diversify the sort of the policy target, or if we're looking at national level policies, which is, very, very different. So there are lots of actually issues we need to think about. But a slightly different, actually, sort of the views I already want to bring in. The more sort of the macro level, the kind of the issues, and I think the NFPA has been actually supporting the sort of the tool called the National Transfer Account. Recently more in the sort of the NTTA, looking at sort of the care economy and how we can actually sort of bring in a sort of economic perspective into the demographic discussions and on that. And I think we believe that that's going to be very informative for the policymaker to formulate the policies. So the Gretchen,
Sorry, Rintaro, can I come in on just a couple of points on that? Is that okay?
Of course, yes, please come in.
Sorry, Gretchen, just take off a minute. And I apologize, my camera stopped working. I'm trying to turn it on and off. Yeah, 3 quick points. So I think this point about the bundling or packaging of different interventions, different contexts, it's really important. It's very challenging for reviews. If they try to look at a single intervention, like decontextualize, it's not going to be terribly helpful. So we have to recognize those, the bundling and differences in context and so on. The second point, though, is that in an ideal world, heterogeneity actually is the friend of meta-analysis, not its enemy. Because if you've got a lot of variation in effect sizes, then you can actually use that to try and explain, well, what's the different contexts or group bundles of interventions that seem to work together or don't work together. I say in the ideal world because you need a lot of studies in order for that approach to work. But in principle, it can work. And the third point I would emphasize is evidence-based policy is never a blueprint approach. It's always here's what the evidence says. You've got to use your own knowledge of local context, your own knowledge of local values, your own knowledge of political circumstances, decide what works there. And in my pyramid, the different levels have different levels of agency for the decision maker. So toolkits just say, here's what the evidence says, you go decide what to do. And guidelines say, well, we've looked at the evidence, we've got some recommendations, but still it's really up to you. It's only checklists that really say, okay, just do this, don't think about it, do this. But the other two very much give agency to decision makers to take the evidence and present it to them in ways they can then decide what to do on their policies based on that, but not solely on that. It's where the values come in, where the politics come in.
Yeah, thank you very much, Howard. Yes, I think I mean, we're not targeting the conversations.
No,
I think but thank you very much. I think yes. I think I mean for example, the Tomas work on the policy reviews. I think yes, we are highlighting the sort of such a heterogeneity, inconsistency, but still, many actually governments of the countries are really appreciated that that summary of the sort of the summary kind of not statistic, but summary actually sort of the directions. What sort of the policy is actually how much effective it is to look at sort of the some of the outcomes related to the law of treaty. So certainly, I think it is really appreciated that sort of they're developing a kind of the summary, actually sort of the reviews. Now, I think I'll actually call upon you, Gretchen. If you could introduce yourself and also probably introduce some of the work, then probably maybe sort of from your perspective, particularly sort of the economics as well as the demography, combined together. What would be a proposal, and I think what would be your views on this sort of the kind of the incoming work what we are thinking. So over to you.
All right, thank you very much. I'm Gretchen Donehower. I'm a photographer at UC Berkeley, and I am going to attempt the very advanced technological feat of screen sharing. So let's see. So I hope that you can actually see that presentation, maybe. Has it come up?
Not yet. Yep, there it is.
Oh, terrific. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I am here as part of the National Transfer Accounts Project. That's our little logo up there on the left. And the blue part there is a stylized picture of the charts that you see on the right. So what the National Transfer Accounts Project does is try to understand the age dimension of economic activity. And that's relevant to fertility policy because the sort of meta, the larger context in which governments are trying to formulate these policies is understanding sort of the costs and benefits, very narrowly defined, of babies, of fertility, of sort of growing humans to continue society, to continue economies. And as I said, narrowly construed. I like my kids just fine. I get lots of satisfaction from them, but there is an economic aspect to them where they're future workers, they are future payers into pension systems, et cetera. So narrowly benefits, narrowly defined here. So the picture on the chart is two age profiles. So these are average flows of economic activity, different types of economic activity, a cross section on an annualized basis. This is an average across 18 very diverse countries. The list is down at the bottom there. And normalized by average labor income age 30 to 49. So you can imagine a 1 value is about a year of labor income from a peak earning age individual. And so this labor income is the earnings from work. So it's your wages, fringe benefits, self-employment income. And then the red line is consumption. So that is privately funded consumption when we pay for our food, clothing, housing, et cetera. It also includes public consumption. So when the government provides healthcare or has a voucher system to provide healthcare, provides education, provides general public services like a fire department or things like that. And so the idea behind sort of this costs and benefits is that those two lines, the labor income versus consumption, shows sort of who needs to get resources and who has them to give. So at the youngest age groups, that consumption line, of course, is above the labor income line. So that's where the costs of that's what children need to have before those lines cross over and they become they generate surplus that can be transferred to others or saved for their own retirement. So this is, as I said, a very narrow idea of kind of what the costs of children are. And then what the benefits of those children are is that eventually they become the ones who are going to provide the surplus. They become the peak age workers. And then further on in life, they become beneficiaries of pension systems, or they become people who are using income generated by assets that they managed to save during working lives. So the idea, the context in many fertility policies is that who's paying for this initial investment where that red line is above the blue line? That's mostly parents. As I mentioned, certainly governments are involved as well, but it's mostly parents. But then who gets the narrowly construed economic benefits of those investments? That's the larger society. The larger society gets to keep going. Pension systems have people to contribute to them eventually. So the idea of the costs of children being born by families, but the benefits accruing to the larger society is where you can get the mismatch and then suboptimal fertility. And so the question of many fertility policies is, are they really addressing the full degree of costs? Are they really covering that really big section where the red line in young ages is above the blue line? Now, there's another part to this, and Victoria mentioned the gender aspects of this. Now, both men and women are working in the labor markets on average and providing resources to kids. But here is, now let's see if I can actually make the screen go forward. Oh, thank goodness. Okay, so another project that's related to the national transfer accounts and our logo on the bottom left is called Counting Women's Work. And this is about adding the whole part of the invisible economy into this picture that is represented by unpaid care work. So I just added 2 dotted lines to that chart. The red dotted line is the consumption of unpaid care work. The blue dotted line is the production. Now, those lines are lower because what we do is we use time use surveys to measure how much time people are producing in unpaid care work. And then in order to compare it with the market economy, we value it at an imputed market wage for those activities. Now, those imputed market wages are quite low. Child care workers earn less than dog walkers in my country, in the United States, on average. And so those wages are pretty terrible. So that's why those numbers or lines are low. The societal value of this work is quite a bit bigger. So it should be understood that those dotted lines are a lower bound. But you'll notice that the biggest consumers of this unpaid care work are the youngest children. So that dotted line all the way to the left for infants is about 0.6 in unpaid care work. They're earning about 60% of a full year of peak labor income, that's what they're consuming. And until about age 3-4, they're consuming more in unpaid care work than in that market-based consumption. And so this relates to fertility policy because this unpaid care work is often invisible because it's not traded on the market. It's outside of traditional economic measurement tools like GDP, total consumption, labor force participation, et cetera. So if you're formulating your fertility policy, trying to compensate for market-based consumption of young children, but not the unpaid care work, which by and large is done by women, then you have both a valuation problem and a gender problem. And so I think I'll stop because that's pretty much just the message. But and the idea with showing these pictures is not that we want to coerce, the goal is not to coerce people into having kids that they didn't want to have, but it's to try to understand what the costs and benefits are of children and to try to not get stuck in this kind of suboptimal trap, and then also to make sure that the gender issues are being understood not just as they relate to sort of market-based labor force participation, market-based inputs, but as they relate to this unpaid care economy, which is easy to ignore because it's so often sort of left out of larger economic contexts and what a lot of policymakers are sort of measuring or on the hook for improving. So, and I'll stop my remarks there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gretchen. I think yes, I think that's actually sort of slightly very kind of slightly different. I don't know, a different perspective on the law fertility issues. Maybe I think in the practice, I think that kind of this data or information is actually sort of it's very important to motivate government to actually sort of default law fertility policies, I think. But anyway, I think probably I really want to sort of open up the floor for the conversations. Then I think if the sort of among the, if you have any comments or questions to each other, raise your hand in a sort of because I'm not familiar with the sort of this sort of
but I think I can see all of you.
So Howard, I cannot see you, but you can actually speak out. We haven't got many actually members. So if you have any question to anybody, they just raise your hand. If not, I think I really want to sort of highlight Stuart was good to say. Well, he was meant to be actually sort of the joining session, but I think he's been trying to log into the session for 15 minutes or so, and with no success. So on behalf of him, I think that I want to actually present what he was supposed to talk. Well, for those of you who don't know, the Professor Stuart Gietel-Basten, he's a professor in social science at the Khalifa University at Abu Dhabi, UAE. He's also known as a demographer. And I think what he was actually he was meant to be talking is actually the principles, the several kind of questions or for us to consider when we actually conducting the kind of the review of the law fertility policies.
First one is about sort of definition.
Whether we're going to look at the more sort of medical perspective or the demography perspective, how we can define the low or ultra low, very low, or too low, whether we're going to come back to the replacement level.
From that,
when we actually sort of doing any scientific work, and we almost don't want to define it, but we have to do it. So that's the question we got. The second part is a bit of a sort of they come up with a conversation from the Vicky and the Tomas on the kind of the two kind of the dimensions. I would say the one is a kind of
naturalistic or the paternalistic kind of sort of the policies or the attitude on the policies.
And also or maybe actually sort of for example, the population aging is a driver for the law fertility policies. That's more about sort of the kind of population mass level, actually sort of the thinking going to the law fertility, where you have a bottom-up problems where you have a gap between differences, like you Gretchen mentioned, ideal family size, and also the TFR. There's a gap between these two, so there is a sort of the mismatch of the sort of the women's sort of the choices. So kind of more from the bottom up the approach. So these two issues are actually sort of the big ones. Then the question is how are we going to tackle it? So certainly these are the issues, but at the same time, many of the low middle income countries, particularly middle income countries with a sort of the fertility decline, they're really wanting to know what policies they need to endorse or develop or implement or prioritize. So and I think they want to lessons learned from the with more sort of the kind of advanced in these policies interventions. So it is such a summary work is very useful, but how are we going to do it? A bit of a challenging, but we just don't want to complain that it is challenging and stop it. We don't want to do that. So that's, I guess, I think my interpretation of this Stuart's presentation. Have you got any sort of the questions or comments each other? Anybody? Yes, Gretchen.
So this is just sort of very pot stirring kind of, but I mean, it's sort of the global level of humans, right? Plenty of humans, global population still growing. And so at a certain point, the justification for trying to sort of address low fertility, or saying that low fertility in one place has to be either because it's very hard to bring people in outside, or that there is just an intrinsic value to growing a population as opposed to being open to immigration, or yeah. And so in that kind of global context, that you could solve everybody's sort of economic problems theoretically through immigration, through then what is sort of, are we obliged to make an argument that there is an intrinsic value to maintaining a population in a place?
Actually, sort of a big question. Thomas, yes, please go ahead.
Yes, I would like to follow up on Gretchen's argument, because indeed the worries about low fertility are very much kind of constrained by the boundaries of countries. It's the governments who worry about having too few Hungarian kids, or too few Iranian kids, or too few Chinese kids. It's not the Hungarians worrying that globally there would be too few children, or Hungarian government worrying that globally there would be a shortage of kids. So this is also a kind of sensitive point, because there is a very fine line between these arguments, which are constrained by national boundaries, and the kind of slide towards ethno-nationalism, where some governments are clearly, and I think Victoria mentioned that, favoring one group over the other with their policies. We have examples of discussions in Eastern European countries, all with low fertility rates, of some of the policymakers being afraid that the Roma minority may misuse the policies and may have too many kids, maybe 3, 4 on average, whereas the majority population will continue having too low fertility rates. So that's of course going towards a very this has very nasty undertones sometimes, but this ethno-nationalism is really featuring quite high as a possible threat in these policy discussions. And I think I would like to raise 2 more issues which are often overlooked in this debate. You mentioned migration, which is a very valid point, because many countries which are actually suffering depopulation on a bigger scale, especially in Eastern and Southeastern Europe, they suffer depopulation because of combination of low fertility and outmigration. But outmigration is playing a bigger role in long term in their depopulation trend. And it's typically outmigration of younger people who are before their prime reproductive ages and who just leave from places like Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia, Albania, Kosovo, Bulgaria to get better jobs, nicer pays, and more economic stability, to Germany, Austria, elsewhere in richer parts of Europe. So even if the governments of, say, Bulgaria or Serbia would miraculously succeed in having their fertility rates at replacement level, there is a very real danger that 20 years down the line, these extra kids just leave the country relatively dysfunctional or poor, and the net effect of policies, even in the long term, would not be really visible in local economy, labor market, whatever social system. So we need to take into account not only what's happening with births, but the whole population trends in a society, which very much includes migration. Because on the other side of the spectrum, we have many Western European countries which have such a high level of immigration on average in the last decades that they can easily live with a fertility rate around 1.2, and still have long-term population increase with their levels of immigration. So one really has to consider more than just fertility rates, thinking about long-term consequences.
So can I come on this? Thank you. So I'm trying to get my camera and I can't do it.
Please come in.
Yeah, two points. So the first point, I mean, on the first point that Gretchen made, there's a clear principle that our job as researchers is to make the evidence available and help explain that evidence to decision makers, and their job is to make the decisions based on that evidence. And I think this is a clear case in point, and we may have our own views, but we also know that in countries with long histories of cultural and ethnic homogeneity, they're much more resistant to immigration than our countries which have more multicultural histories over the last decades, going on to even centuries now. And you see that slowly changing. So an openness to Japan, to Filipino migrants starting up, for example. But it's a slow change. The second point I've got, so the and actually yes, and even in countries that have a lot of migration, like the UK, I'm British, I live in Germany, I'm British, clearly there's starting to be more resistance to it. One fact I found while doing the scoping on this work is that across Britain as a whole, a third of all children now born to mothers who weren't themselves born in the UK. In some areas like London, it's 3/4 of children are born to mothers that aren't from the UK. So when people speak about London not being a British city anymore, you sort of see where they're coming from actually when you read statistics like that, and you can't you can't ignore it. I mean, you can feel what you like about it, but you can't ignore it. So you have to put those facts clearly available. And the other second point is why I think the second point is why I think it's in this work in all areas, but this work in particular, it's so important to look at drivers and consequences, not just interventions, because that's precisely what we're saying is, well, if the consequences are you're worried about the rising dependency ratio, there are other ways of tackling that rather than increasing fertility. You can actually use migration instead, and you might use managed migration or in some way to tackle that problem. And then the point that Thomas is making to look at drivers, and so precisely the point about, well, it's actually out migration that's doing you in, not the low fertility. That's the bigger driver of depopulation, is the out migration. And so that's they're not demographic fertility oriented policies at all. It's just trying to make it more attractive to stay in Albania if you're Albanian or Romania or whatever, Bosnia and so on, to try and make it more attractive to stay there and point out, that you've got. They'll look at the drivers, look at the consequence, alternative way of tackling the consequences and trying to tackle the drivers at source, rather than saying, oh, we have to tackle fertility head on. And I think, I mean, I've read your work, certainly the reviews of the UNFPA Commission, I've read them. And I know you make those points, but I think for decision makers, those points need to be made again and again and again, so that they see that and think about the problem in a more diverse way.
Yeah, thank you very much, Howard. We got only 1.5 minutes, and I think I was told that because of this platform, it's going to all. So we need to stop actually. But I think I really want to make it a sort of last interventions, but sort of particularly from the East Asian context. I think we don't need to have a sort of a target fertility rate, but I think in our Eastern Asian context, for example, some of the very low fertility you see in the Republic of Korea and in the part of the Japan and some other countries is actually the symptom of the certain issues, social issues. Could be gender issues, or maybe actually sort of the too costly childcare, or there's too very expensive to have a children. That is actually social developmental issue. I think whatever we think, I think it's a good idea to explore what will be the policy options are. So we got only 30 seconds. So I think that we probably gradually, I'm going to gradually summarize. I'm not going to summarize, but I think we actually sort of just to say, we want to continue to have a conversations and in the various sort of opportunities. And I think they really want to sort of push start this work. And I think they really thank sort of all of the panelists. And I think it was quite interesting. And I think the discussion is getting hotter, but we need to stop it here now. But I think we really want to have a conversation again. So all of you, thank you very much. And this session is sponsored by UNFPA. So UNFPA is welcome to have sort of the continued conversation with all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Pleasure to meet you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you. Thanks,
Nice to meet you.
Rintaro.
Thank you.